So, what's our response? And specifically, how does Dr. Mona do environmental justice? She has a program called Community Pediatrics. She's actually faculty at the med school that's run out of the Flint Hospital. And her rotation, when the med students come to her to learn things, they do a program called Community Pediatrics, which Dr. Mona defines as an approach that looks at environmental and community factors that can affect health. It's a much more holistic approach than, well, this picture shows an example of, you listen to their heart, you take a blood sample, measure their blood pressure, all of these kind of just typical physical exam that you get when you go to the doctor. Well, she includes much wider range of just measures of her patient's health. She will look for things called adverse childhood experiences, or she also calls them toxic stresses. These are things like food and housing insecurity. Do you have enough food? Do you have a stable place to live? Do you have a safe place to play outdoors? It's been shown in many studies that playing outdoors is good for physical, mental, and emotional health of growing children. But do they have a place where they can do that? And then, of course, specifically relating to this case, are they exposed to pollutants and toxins? So again, this is a holistic approach that goes beyond what you would see in a typical exam. Dr. Mona will also try and find out, are her patients at risk for other health problems because of these adverse childhood experiences. And specifically in response to the Flint Water Crisis, to mitigate, to help deal with the problem, because I should have pointed this out in the previous lecture. The lead neurotoxin is irreversible. The impact on the child's developing brain, to the best of our knowledge right now, is not reversible. So that's permanent damage. So what she did is created what's called the Flint Registry to keep track of all of the children who are exposed to high lead levels in their water and also had high blood lead levels. And this registry provides resources so she can get that information out to the community, resources for healing, like special programs for learning disabilities. Now I want to back up even farther and talk about philosophy of science, which may seem dry, but is actually pretty interesting when you apply it to a specific case like the Flint Water Crisis. So a couple things I wanted to highlight that she talked about, Dr. Mona did in her book. One of them is called Kehoe's paradigm. So a paradigm is a way of thinking and a way of approaching things like scientific inquiry. So this paradigm is named after an individual named Robert Kehoe, and he actually worked for General Motors in Flint, Michigan, by coincidence, because this is somewhat of a coincidence that it's also in Flint, Michigan, because this paradigm actually formed the foundation for a law regarding toxic substances. So this Dr. Robert Kehoe's work spread far beyond just Flint, Michigan, but coincidentally applied very specifically to this case in many years later, because he was around in, I forgot, I'm going to say 1920s, 1930s, so long before the Flint Water Crisis. Anyway, what Kehoe's approach says is that the burden of proof is on people like Dr. Mona to prove that there's actually harm, instead of the opposite. So the opposite would be the city of Flint has to prove that there is no harm. No, that's not the approach that Kehoe argued. Kehoe said, let's just assume that lead is fine. Lead doesn't do any damage to people unless you can prove me otherwise, which is a really dangerous approach. That instead of having to prove that you're safe, you have to prove that you're being harmed, which means a lot of people could be harmed before we get enough scientific data to be able to say that harm is occurring. And that's exactly what happened in Flint. This approach was taken, and a lot of people were harmed in the process. Safe. I talked about this in the previous lectures. What is considered to be a safe level of lead? The CDC sets it here at 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. That's arbitrary. Who came up with that number is not based on any kind of scientific research into the effects of lead on the brain. It's just an arbitrary cutoff, not even sure where it came from. I don't think Dr. Mona in her book came up with um, a specific reason why this particular arbitrary number was arrived at. It's not supported by any evidence. And Dr. Mona would argue there is no safe level of lead. You've got any lead in your blood at all, that's harmful. So let's talk about another broad approach to science. We're going even broader here. I want to talk about objectivity for just a little bit. Science is often viewed as being objective, meaning there's no favoritism or bias towards one side or the other. Whether or not your hypothesis is confirmed or supported, you're just going to let the numbers tell the story. The numbers don't lie. So, science, in being objective, anybody with any opinions or biases of their own, if they conducted the same study, two people would arrive at the same conclusions. That would be objectivity of science. Subjectivity would be a biased approach. So the experience or knowledge, as conditioned by personal mental characteristics or state, and I would also say maybe your identity as well, is going to affect your opinion, your bias, your position. And by the way, everyone is biased. It's impossible not to be a biased because we all have a position within this world, and everyone's position is a little bit different. And having bias is okay. It's not necessarily an evil thing, because it could bias you in good ways. You could be biased in very positive ways. But usually, traditionally, people have not thought of science as being subjective because, again, the numbers don't lie. But I would argue to you, it's not necessarily the case. So there is a lot of objectivity in science. You can objectively measure somebody's blood lead level, and two different scientists with different biases could do that in a lab and they'd come up with the exact same number. So measuring those lead levels is objective. But where subjectivity comes in is, why do we even ask the question in the first place? Why do we think it's important to measure blood lead levels? Because the city of Flint would have argued, and the state of Michigan would have argued, it's not important. Their bias was, everything is fine. We did everything right. We don't need to do any further inquiries. We don't need to go out on a limb for Flint. And Dr. Mona, her bias was, no, we have to consider the totality of a child's environment, and any possible adverse child experience or toxic stressor is worth investigating to make absolutely sure that they're safe. She wanted to prove, well, she did prove harm, but she also took the approach of, I want to be sure. If they are safe, that's great, but I want to be sure of it. So there is subjectivity in how you approach. And also, another classic example of objectivity in this particular case would be this arbitrary number. It's not based on evidence. There undoubtedly was somebody who had just an opinion, not based on evidence, that was a fine, safe lead level. And that's not objective at all. That wraps up our Flint Water Crisis lecture series.